First of all, I never thought I'd sell my staffing company. The last thing anybody logically would do is, hey, you have a newborn, a 1 and a 2-year-old. Why don't you sell a company? First time I'd ever done that. It's a big deal. And then start a new company from scratch, a technology company. This is new to you. You're not by trade a technologist. All of those things, when you look at it through that lens, that's not smart. But it just made sense. And I felt like, man, I could help a lot more people this way.
I'm Matt Tate, founder of Decimal and fellow entrepreneur. Yes, I'm one of the crazy ones. I've chosen time and time again to hustle my way through that first million. Now, I'm scaling to the next 50. So I know firsthand what the messy middle is really like. And I know that entrepreneurs and leaders like us need a destination for empowerment, community, and encouragement. This is our place. This is After the First Million. Today, we are excited to have Jeremy Reymer join us, a true pioneer in the trucking industry. With over 2 decades of experience, Jeremy has navigated the messy middle of entrepreneurship and the complex landscape of trucking more than once. If building a $20 million staffing company wasn't enough, Jeremy jumped right back into the ring after selling it and started DriverReach, a technology company helping other trucking companies make hiring better and easier. The journey and background extends well beyond entrepreneurship. He's demonstrated time and again his ability to seize opportunities, drive growth, and do it with an unabashed authenticity. Jeremy's insights are invaluable, his experience vast, and his impact immeasurable. Welcome, Jeremy, to After the First Million.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for that intro.
Well, I appreciate it. And you and I have known each other for years. We'll get that out right away. And I've always admired how you've done business, and I'm excited to learn kind of more of the story today. But before we get started, I always start with this question, because as you know, to run a company and start a business, you have to be just a little bit crazy. So when did you know that you were one of the crazy ones?
I realized early on that working for someone else was suboptimal than working for yourself. And so the only way to really do that, you're going to have to start a business, buy a business, run a company so you can be the one in charge.
I always joke that I make a terrible employee, and I think that's probably a theme we could have for this whole podcast and all of these stories.
But I'd like to say I could be a good example for employees too. It's hard working for someone else. I've handled a lot of risk in my life, and so far, so good. So it's calculated risk. It's not reckless, but I'm not afraid of risk.
I like to think that we don't mind jumping off, but we do look first to see that there's a pool under there.
Good analogy, because I 100% agree. I think that's the mindset.
So as we kind of get started, I would love for you to start your story at the beginning, because you've ended up and spent a career in an industry that is very much an insider's industry, and it's more complex than I think people know and understand. And having grown up in it myself, in trucking and around trucking, I know that. But you weren't initially in that industry. You came to it kind of luckily.
Yeah, business opportunity that presented itself. I was actually living right across from the ocean, Long Beach, California, and had a business opportunity come up. Family-owned business said, hey, why don't you consider coming out here and help me run this small staffing company that was just formed? And I said, Indiana, trucking, no thanks, no interest. That makes no sense. But that offer kept presenting itself. And then I ended up getting married. And I said to my wife, what do you think? Yeah, let's give it a shot. See what happens. If we don't like it, we'll come back. So we left sunny Southern California, moved to Indiana, central Indiana, here in Indianapolis, and really immediately sort of immersed ourselves into the trucking industry. And I realized, A, how huge this industry is, and B, how deficient it is when it comes to sophistication. I won't even get to technology yet, just sophistication in general. And then I recognized what an opportunity there was, because the demand for truck drivers was considerable, like significantly greater than the supply. And so that happened to be the business that I was getting involved in. And fast forward a few years, I ended up having the opportunity to buy that company. Not a great time in the market. If you remember the wonder years of the Great Recession, you were taking on some risk, but I felt like it was calculated. I knew that we'd get through this. I knew that nothing fundamentally had changed. We just got to hunker down through that period until I sold that company. We continued to grow. And that's when I really started getting involved in building technology and so forth. And I don't want to get too far ahead of our conversation, but that's the background coming into it, just really eye opening at how big and important the trucking industry was. I have never been a part of an industry as big as it is. It's so tight knit, as you said, sort of an insider. And the relationships, if you really embrace it and really get in, you can build relationships, genuine good relationships that'll last a lifetime. And that's what I've had now for 20 years in trucking.
Well, I think that's a really cool anchor to being in an industry. And I'm somebody that's jumped over half a dozen industries myself. And I think it's so cool that you found trucking as being a home. And quite frankly, for you and your family, let's kind of go back because you decided to move to Indiana, which I'm from Indiana. I love this state, but it's not a beach, and help start this company. And I know that your wife at the time, Wendy, really helped encourage you to do that, but that had to have been a little bit scary.
It was less scary for me than it might have been for her. I had lived in Tennessee, I'd lived in Georgia, and I feel like genuinely I could live anywhere, certainly in America, really almost anywhere. Now there's trade-offs, right? Whether it's weather, food, job opportunities, but I really believe I could live anywhere in the United States. We had family here, so that helped. But really, when we left, there was no turning back. You really have to be that way if you're going to do something like this. And, you've heard the term burn the boats. I mean, that's kind of the mindset that we had when we left. Now, that being said, you got to give it a shot. Maybe that's 2 to 3 years at least. And if we didn't like it, then we might have turned tail and headed back. But it was great. I mean, the opportunity was amazing. The people were great. And now we've got a 10, 11, and 12-year-old. They're Hoosiers. This is all they know. We'll go visit California, but we're not going anywhere. This is great. I mean, my kids wouldn't want to leave if we planned on it.
Well, and I think that's cool because before even your kids, you moved back to Indiana. You're in a company that effectively is like a startup. It hadn't been around for very long. And then you get the chance to buy the business in 2008, which, as we all know who were around in 2008, wasn't the world's greatest time. What caused you to take that leap?
The opportunity was there. We'd taken our lumps. Actually, it started a small trucking company then too, which anybody in trucking knows that razor thin margins that exist in trucking in the good times.
Oh, yeah.
When they're bad, you're upside down, cash intensive type of business. And there's an old adage in trucking, you make $1 million in trucking, you start with 2 million. And that was me. I was the poster child of that. I think I lost about $1 million during that foray into owning a trucking company. But that didn't bring the entire business down, the staffing company. But I knew that things were going to get better. They would pick back up. And frankly, it was not so bad. I mean, in hindsight, it's easy to say that. In the middle of it, it was awful. But it was probably March or April of 2009 where we really started to see things accelerate for like the next 6, 7 years at least. It was really smooth sailing. So calculated risk, and I'm okay with that.
Well, and you've kind of hit on something, and I've been there too, where calculated risk isn't always reward. So calculated risk, you bought a staffing company and that ended up going through its lumps, but it turned out well. And then what made you want to have a secondary business in trucking? Like what spurred you to that opportunity?
The biggest challenge that most carriers, most trucking companies had in those years, they needed drivers. Well, I had them and I had good ones, and I had good ones that really liked me and knew that if I started a trucking company, they would work for me. And there was an over the road trucking company, automotive parts. We had, a bunch of different lanes, and, we had about 20 or so trucks at our peak. So that was really the impetus. It was, hey, look, the biggest demand that companies have is drivers. I have that. So if I can just get freight and equipment, I can do this. But I was an absolute idiot and novice when it comes to running a trucking company. Absolutely not. I wouldn't do it again. I failed. I'm okay with that. I would not do it again. I would much rather be a provider of a service to those companies versus being one myself.
I prefer to be a client than a lawyer, and I learned that the hard way. Was that the first time you'd ever failed anything?
I mean, I failed in the sense that I closed up this shop, right? Closed up the business. But that being said, it could have been much worse because it could have impacted the staffing company, which was sort of the bellwether business that also struggled through that period, but certainly was strong enough to muddle through it, if not for this really heavy weight, around the neck, which is this trucking company. So from that standpoint, navigating that exit while not completely destroying the staffing company that I just bought, that was the biggest challenge. So to say, while I would say I failed from a trucking company, honestly, I succeeded in successfully failing.
None of us make it through life with full success. We all go through the ups and downs, but are there lessons that you learned going through that successful failure that helped you be more successful in the next phase of the staffing company? And what were they?
Well, first of all, I learned a ton, right, about what it's like to run a trucking company and what my customers deal with, the challenges they face. I learned a lot. I could not have learned that going to any Ivy League school. I might have spent more than an Ivy League school.
Which is tough.
Right. I learned a ton. And also, I just grew as a leader, how to deal with stress, how to deal with people, how to deal with conflict. Those are invaluable things. So I don't speak of that period, those few years as an owner in a negative way. Eye opening education. And here, I probably what I would have learned looking back now is fools rush in, right? That's what I did. I rushed into this thing, didn't know what I was getting into, didn't understand market dynamics at the time, but felt like, why can't I do it? And if these people can do it, I can. I mean, it's confidence, but also I think I'm a little bit more calculated today than I was then.
So, one of the questions that I have is you have something, and I've talked to you about this before, that I think is exceptionally unique in almost any business owner that I talk to. And that is that you and your wife work together and have worked together forever. Wendy, was she working in both businesses at the time?
Yes, we did not work together when we were in California, when we were in Long Beach. She was a teacher. When I left the trading floor of the stock exchange, when it closed, we had already met. I was trading on my own, but we didn't start working together until we moved to Indiana. And frankly, as we were just growing and scaling as a small company, I needed good, competent people. And I'm like, how about you? I know there are probably people who that is just insane, the idea of working with your spouse. I have absolutely no problem with that. In fact, she's very smart. She's very competent. She completes me in a lot of ways. I think that we work well together. I think we can work better together. I really enjoy us working together.
Well, I think that's really cool because a lot of people talk about how hard it is to take that first leap of, I need to find people that compliment me and people that help push me to be better versus people that are like me. And you did that early on and you were lucky enough to find that at home too. When you were going through the period of that '08 trucking company, that expensive education, which is how I talk about my business failure. I think it was an amazing education. I learned a ton. I would not be where I am today without having done that. How did Wendy and even the team at the staffing company, how did they help you get to that next phase, which you've already pointed out and I want to talk about was growth?
Well, I can tell you what I remember about those years. We had to lean up. We had an office in Cincinnati at the time. We had to really ratchet that back, but not too much. I mean, honestly, I didn't shed too much in terms of expenses and personnel, especially. And I remember one of the people who was a really important, valuable employee who also did payroll and accounts, receivable and so on, recognized that we were upside down week after week and said, do I need to try to find another job? Knowing that the market at the time, that was not going to be an easy thing to do. And Wendy and I both said, we dropped our salaries more than a half. We knew what we needed to make in order to just pay our mortgage. And we didn't have kids yet. And so we did that and we took it on the chin. And I think in hindsight, I believe that attitude from me at that time solidified the loyalty that I had from not only that person, but all the people that worked for me at that time and saw what we sacrificed ourselves so that they wouldn't suffer. And these are good people I'm talking about. And when we were able to get on the other side of this recession, those people worked for me really up until I sold the company. That was almost 10 years later. So my point is that level of sacrifice, I saw that as leadership at that time, is me saying, "Hey, I've got you. Follow me." And we were blessed enough to get through that. And then I trusted in a process that if we do that, that we're going to have some really good people that know where we stand when the rubber meets the road. And it's a people business that we're in, whether that's in trucking or anything. It's always going to be about people and how you treat them, how you take care of them, and that sort of thing. So those are a lot of lessons learned there
Not everybody makes that decision. What made you guys decide to do it?
because I knew who they were. I knew what they were made of. And I knew that if the shoe were on the other foot, I think they would have made the same decision. And I knew we'd get through it. I was confident that we'd get through this and we'd be okay. We did. Now, it could have gone worse. It could have lasted longer, and it could have been that I part ways. But I did everything I could before that. And fortunately, it didn't come to that. So I'm grateful for that.
So then after you get through that period, you get into the growth. And eventually, when you exited the company, it was 20 million in revenue. Talk about that scaling period.
I think I shared earlier that I recognized early on how deficient the trucking industry was. And I mentioned sophistication, which is true. And that's still relatively true, especially compared to other more innovative and progressive industries. But it's also really deficient when it comes to technology, and certainly around the HR and recruiting technology side of this highly regulated industry. And so I started building technology. Not that I'm a technologist, but I just knew I need something that can do this and this and this. It would help us. It would automate some things. It would help me grow and scale this more and really separate myself from my much larger competitors. And so I started investing in technology. It was really just on the other side of the Great Recession. And as I kept doing that and kept building that, I built a really robust platform for me, which was great. That certainly helped us grow and scale, provide a level of service that was always really consistent with our customers, with how we hired, onboarded drivers and managed them and so on. So it allowed us to be efficient and profitable and so on. But at the same time, I had built something that I felt like if I could offer this to the industry, to the market, I could help a heck of a lot more people than I could with my staffing company. So I really came to a crossroads where I had to decide, do I go and raise capital and try to do this thing with this new software that I've built? Or do I sell my staffing company and then use the proceeds from that to bootstrap this other entity, and I could be all in there? And that was the decision I made when I sold my staffing company to a much larger PE-owned competitor. And then I was all in on DriverReach. That was the name of the company that I started. And when I started raising seed round, which was just a bridge to an eventual Series A.
I always talk about the messy middle as being that stage when you kind of go from that 1 million in revenue to the like, oh shit, I'm building a company now. That's when you start to put in the stuff that sometimes guys like you and I aren't great at: processes, systems. You took it a whole step further and built your own system.
Yeah, there wasn't anything that existed. We're going back to the early days when, you first heard of Salesforce. I built CRM functionality. Back then, it was so new.
So that investment led you through to building a successful staffing company. But then one of your career themes and premises is be all in. And so you had two things and you made the choice to go be all in with DriverReach, the technology company.
It wasn't chasing the dollars. You talk about the messy middle. That was never the case with the staffing company either. You'd put your head down and go to work and focus. And then every once in a while you'd look up and go, man, we're doing pretty good. But then you just put your head down and focus again. And the goal to me was never make as much money as I could. The goal was help as many people as you can, solve a problem that they have. And if you do that well, the byproduct will be success. So that's just always been the way I think. It's a longer game, I think, in the grand scheme of things, but it certainly served me well in the staffing world and staffing industry. And that was my mindset when I sold that company to start DriverReach. First of all, I never thought I'd sell my staffing company. We started having kids. I mean, the last thing anybody logically would do is, hey, you have a newborn, a 1 and a 2-year-old. Why don't you sell a company, which that's a whole thing. And that's the first time I'd ever done that. It's a big deal. And then start a new company from scratch, a technology company. This is new to you. You're not by trade a technologist. All of those things, when you look at it through that lens, that's not smart. But it just made sense. And I felt like, man, I could help a lot more people this way. And so far, we're growing, we're doing well. We're in the midst of now what's been the last 2 years, a pretty significant freight recession after, really a hangover, if you will, after what COVID did to trucking, which was the pendulum swung real far, demand and supply chain issues. But that being said, we're approaching $5 million in annual recurring revenue, and certainly something to be proud of. I would hope that we had gotten there sooner than we have, but there are things that you can control and there are things you have limited control over.
So you knew staffing, you knew trucking, you sold staffing, and you started a software business, which in trucking, sort of the same industry, but boy, is it different to build a tech company, isn't it?
It's a lot different. You got to surround yourself with people who know what they're doing, kind of what we were talking about earlier, that complement your areas of weakness. And that's certainly mine. I mean, I'll say Sam Bloomquist, who's Chief Technology Officer of DriverReach, was here and has been here since the very beginning. It was really before I made the decision to sell the staffing company. He was actually the CTO of both my staffing company and what became DriverReach from the beginning. And aligning with him certainly helped. Not that he had success as a CTO in a startup company necessarily, but he certainly is the technologist and that's his pedigree. So, but on top of those things, integrity was key. And we got to know each other a little bit. Our kids go to school together. And so having that familiarity and trust was critical.
That's something that you've always valued, integrity and trust. Is it always something that's been reciprocated in your big hires?
I don't know if you're familiar with this Warren Buffett adage. It's when you hire people, you want to hire people who are smart and people who are driven. But above all, you want to hire people who have integrity because without that, those other two things will destroy you. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but especially leadership roles, right? People who have a big responsibility and integrity matters a ton. But sometimes you think that you're hiring somebody that checks all those boxes and you don't know until you've worked together. And usually it's when there's some challenge or conflict or some situation that comes up where things might be revealed. That's always how that works. That's when the cracks show, when there's pressure. That's always at the forefront of my mind, how you hire people and the types of people and the quality of people you hire. I've made some costly mistakes. I'm still around, so they weren't that costly, but same is true with valuable education. In some cases, I'm still paying for.
Doesn't matter if you're still paying for it or not, you're still learning from it. Now, we've talked about '08 and how hard that was. And I think those of us like you and me who are old enough, we all thought '08 was going to hit and it was going to be the hardest thing we were going to deal with. Then COVID happened. And I feel like that's one of those mental turning points for every single one of us who was a leader during that time period. Talk about how it was for you.
I mean, it was tough. Don't get me wrong. We're in the midst. I've got children. Number one, I've got a family to protect and take care of, including my father, who was living with us at the time, and he's older and not in the best of health. And so, first and foremost, you got to protect your family. And then I also have this other family, which we had probably 20 ish employees or so, something like that at the time. And all of a sudden, the whole world is shut down. And we were already right around that time starting to have conversations with raising some capital as we were getting low on funds that I had used from a bootstrap standpoint. And so, not the best time to have a global pandemic. I don't know that there is a good time, but we had to all go remote. We had an office in Indianapolis. We had people, some remote people, but by and large, we were together in Indy. We had to all go remote. And so the first thing I knew to do is everybody is feeling the same way I am, right? Scared, wondering what's going on, all kinds of emotions, uncertainty. And so all I can do as a leader is communicate with them often, consistently. So almost daily, and certainly a couple times a week at least, video messages that I'd record early in the morning when I would wake up. But it's just like, here's where we are, here's what's happening. I just wanted to keep people feeling like we're going to be okay. Don't be afraid. There's a concern here, obviously, but be smart. Let's work together. We're going to be fine. Like, we're going to get through this together, and those sorts of things. Just really trying to keep morale up and know that they see me at the front of the line. So, from that perspective, I think that was helpful. What I didn't share with them at the time, but I'll share with you now, is where was I going to get money from? Who would, in their right mind, write me a check to invest in my small growing startup in the midst of that environment? It was not easy. I will say what I was fortunate enough to rely on is enough close industry relationships that I had built over the years because of how I conducted myself and the relationships that I had built, the trust that I had built. That can get you pretty emotional, because if not for that, man, I don't know where we'd be. So I was really, really grateful to get over that hump. Quite honestly, what was a real blessing was come probably mid 2020, all of a sudden we started growing like crazy because the demand for drivers and freight and everything. But you didn't know that in March and April. In March and April, everybody was batting down the hatches like, you don't go out of your house. You wear a mask to sleep in the shower. If you got something delivered on your porch, you're hosing it off.
I felt like during that time, we were playing therapist to our families, therapist to our employees, and therapist to our clients. And another thing that I feel like is a big transition moment for you and even the trucking industry. I don't feel like there's any single event that happened in the world that highlighted the importance and size and scope of trucking more than the pandemic did.
Like I said, when the pendulum swings forward one way, it comes back the other way. And two things that you reminded me of. One, video calls didn't start during COVID. Now, they certainly went to a whole nother level, right? Exponential growth. But we were already doing that before a little bit, like sales and stuff. And I remember at a time, check your background, make sure, you buttoned up and all that kind of stuff. You got to look great and be professional. No dogs, no kids running in the room. For me, I especially through COVID, look, I'm in your home. You've invited me to your home and vice versa. It's very intimate. You're there, you got your kids, you got everything is there because of this pandemic. Who cares? In fact, I almost want you to have some natural life interruptions and family stuff because that's just real and it's okay. Because people go, I'm so sorry, my kid, and I'm like, it's okay. That hasn't changed for me now because I think it's an opportunity to connect deeper.
Gave us all more empathy and allowed us to really feel that in a more authentic way because you couldn't judge somebody when the same was happening to you 2 minutes later. So you and I first met as you went through this fundraising, which for somebody that grew up in an industry, in a business and staffing, that you eat what you kill. You grow for profit. Profit is how you grow your business. Software is a little bit different and fundraising is way different. And the whole economic model is upside down in a lot of ways. Talk about how you navigated that.
That was what spearheaded our getting to know each other and our relationship is you having that background and that experience. I was an absolute novice to how to even go about doing this. How do I tell the story in a pitch deck that, I can share with people? And that was huge, critically helpful to me. It's a big difference talking to my personal network of people in the industry, those who believe in me. That's much easier compared to pitching to a company is professional money that knows nothing or very little about trucking and all the challenges and all the things that we know to be true. And a lot of times you're having conversations with people saying, well, I hear what you're saying, but autonomous trucks are going to be coming down the pike pretty soon and there won't be CDL drivers anymore. This is going to be like the buggy whip. Having to have those conversations, sometimes that you just couldn't convince them otherwise, and so be it. We were fortunate enough to partner with a company that had a little bit of exposure to the trucking space, to transportation in general, and was a B2B SaaS VC, had a lot of experience there. So that was really helpful. But I can tell you what a major distraction that is if your job, and as the founder and CEO at the time, going in and spending all of my days trying to have those types of conversations and As you can imagine, you can't focus on the business so much. So my advice to anybody out there, if you don't need to raise professional money, don't, because it is a huge distraction. I mean, most people probably it's either that or you're not independently wealthy. You're not on your own, most likely. So you need capital, but it's a daunting undertaking and it never ends, it seems.
No, it never does. And I'll throw another caveat. If you raise money when you don't need it, it's always better.
That's how banks work, right?
100%.
They always want to give money to the person who doesn't need it. But when you really need it, they're like, no. They don't have the same approach to risk I do.
They don't even do the jumping off thing. So as you've grown in DriverReach, one of the things that I've always thought was really cool about you is almost as a side hobby, but it tailors into what you're doing today. You've become a really big advocate for the trucking industry and a really big, I'd say, presence in the industry itself. What kind of led you to do that?
I think the door was open. First of all, you got to care. No one's going to commit that level of effort and time and relationship and so on if you don't care. So you really got to care. That's table stakes. But then when you see that there's opportunity, and I'm not saying opportunity to grow this company, again, that's a byproduct. But if you really care and you know certain things that you could really help companies with and educate them on better best practices around recruiting and retention and compliance being a real big part of trucking as well, when you can provide that level of education and share that and you have opportunities to speak and present, and then you do that over and over again, and then leverage the power of business social media, LinkedIn, and things like that, you just become this presence and people get to know you. And then I had an opportunity to start a podcast, and it seemed like the early years of podcasting. And I thought, that makes no sense for me. Not that I was afraid of the idea. It's just, I didn't know what to do. Like, I just sold this company. I'm trying to build something. I don't even know where to begin. But then a couple of years later, Freightwaves, which is sort of like the CNN of trucking, approached me and said, "Hey, you're an expert in recruiting and retention and stuff like that. We're going to put together some podcasts in different segments of the industry. And we think you'd be a really good one for this. What do you think?" And I'm like, "So you're going to do all the production and promotion, which is a big deal. I'm in." And I quickly said, "We need to do this every week." And while I know that's more time commitment, there was just so much content, whether it's trucking companies that I could interview or other vendors who are addressing this area in the industry. There's no shortage of opportunities and options from a content standpoint. So now I'm on 4 years of that. And that I think has really helped that presence, just awareness of me personally, but also the brand that is DriverReach.
Well, and it also seems like it's helped you in your mission to just generally raise the water level for an industry.
Let me just add something because I hired a CEO who came on board and allowed me to take a step back from a lot of the day to day. I'm still the face and voice of the company in many ways. I'm still speaking. I'm doing all these sorts of things, right? But one of the things that I have become more passionate about, and this is especially since I'd say in the last 6 months or more, I heard a statistic that was a shock to the heart, which was that the average life expectancy of a CDL driver is 61 years old. And I knew it was significantly less than like, the average population, but that just hits you right between the eyes. And I think I've heard that stat. It's about a 10-year-old stat out from the CDC. Maybe it just didn't impact me the same. I turned 50 last year, and about 2 years ago, I started really being more mindful of what I eat and pretty strict now from a diet standpoint, nutrition, exercising pretty consistently, and sleep, and all those things. So I'm doing that for me. But drivers don't. They have one of the worst jobs for this. The environment that they operate in is just not conducive to those critical pillars of lifespan or health span. And so that's something that I'm really starting to get my heart around. And exactly what that means yet, I can't say. I don't know for sure, but I want to affect change there. I want to move that needle because 61 is just unacceptable to me.
That's crazy. You are now not the CEO of your business, and you've started multiple companies. No doubt you have another company left in you. Would you go tech or would you go services?
There's nothing that has more enterprise value. I don't want to seem like I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth when I say that, you're not chasing the money side of it, but in terms of just real worth and value, because to do this again, man, that's a big undertaking. If that were the case, especially starting from scratch, it's got to be worth it. As much as I want to be altruistic, I'm not there. Everything is still in DriverReach. So unless or until I win the lottery or there's a significant exit from DriverReach, I'm not at the mercy just to do things out of the goodness of my heart only. Now, what is easy to get around is if I can do something and affect change, leveraging my standing and influence in the industry towards helping to move that needle. And if there's a technology play there, which there are a few that I'm really close to, then that's something I can really get behind because I think it's certainly worth the squeeze.
Jeremy, I really appreciate the time. Thank you for popping on. Thank you for joining us. Before we wrap, I do have one last question. What advice would you give yourself when you were first starting?
I'm always trying to learn and grow and improve. I'm doing that. Get enough feedback, get enough input to help you make a decision. First of all, you're ultimately who has to make that decision, but surround yourself with really good people and get as much input from different facets that you can. Helps you to just make better, especially big decisions, important decisions. That's probably the advice I'd give myself because I don't think that's a strength.
Thanks so much for listening. After the First Million is presented by Decimal. To listen to more episodes and find tips to help make running a business easier, visit decimal.com/AFM. Want to join the conversation? Reach out to me on LinkedIn and let's explore the messy middle.